Hey guys, tonight we are going to step into a chamber where the air is thick with the scent of incense smoke. So heavy you can almost taste the bitterness on your tongue. Imagine a royal tower in the sweltering heat of summer, its windows sealed shut, not to keep out assassins or spies, but to trap the stench of a little princess whose body was slowly rotting from within. This is absolutely not the kind of fairy tale palace you'd want to wander into at midnight. In fact, if you were one of the unfortunate servants forced to stand in that tower for more than an hour, you surely wouldn't survive. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And by the way, let me know in the comments, where in the world are you listening to this story from? And what time is it where you are right now? I really love imagining all of us, each in different places, sharing a chilling tale beneath different skies. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the summer of 1462, a heavy heat descended upon the Alcázar of Segovia like a thick blanket smothering every living creature. Inside the gilded palace, beneath lavish embroidered tapestries, the young Princess Isabel, only 8 years old, the only daughter of King Enrique IV, lay drowsy on her bed, sweat pouring from her body and her breath ragged. The cause seemed so small just a few days earlier. During a stroll in the rose garden, she had stumbled, and a thorn pierced her ankle. At the time, no one paid attention. Just a scratch. The ladies in waiting often suffered such things. But 3 days passed, and the delicate skin around the ankle turned into an ulcer, red and swollen, beginning to ooze a yellowish fluid. The stench, at first faint, now hung thick throughout the chamber. Her loyal attendant, Beatrice de Bobadilla, both tutor and sister figure to the princess, trembled as she lifted the linen cloth to look again at the wound. She nearly dropped the cloth she was holding the flesh. Around the thorn's entry had turned blackish purple, veins swollen and twisted in dark lines, creeping up the slender leg. Beatrice quickly ordered a servant to fetch the royal physician, while she tried to keep the princess conscious with a rosewater-soaked cloth pressed to her burning forehead. Not long after, the renowned physician Abraham Jalib arrived. He was a Jew, a community often mistrusted at court. Yet their medical knowledge was undeniable. The bearded doctor, his eyes sharp and weary, sighed as he examined the wound. He whispered, "Gangrene. The disease will spread quickly, and soon the stench of flesh will be far worse." The news was reported at once to the king. Enrique IV, long accustomed to dealing with rebellions or disputes with Aragon, was helpless before the sight of his little daughter slipping into death's grasp. He commanded summon every physician in the court, and if need be, invite the doctors from Granada. I will spare no expense. That very night, the princess was moved to the North Tower, a secluded place to contain the stench of death. The windows were sealed with thick velvet drapes, leaving only a narrow slit for air. Guards patrolled the corridor outside. In the chamber, thick with incense and resin smoke, the physicians busied themselves grinding herbs, rosemary, sage, lavender, all mixed with vinegar and wine to cleanse the wound. Barrels of vinegar and jars of boiling wine were carried up constantly. And then, the arguments began. Jalib, faithful to the traditions of Greek and Arabic medicine, insisted on cleansing with vinegar and bloodletting to draw out the poisons in the veins. But Diego Rodriguez, a battlefield surgeon newly summoned from Toledo, shook his head. He had cut, cauterized, and burned through hundreds of wounds in war. With his calloused hands, Rodriguez declared, "We must cut it open to drain the pus and pour boiling oil over it, or the rot will climb to the knee." The room fell silent. The thought of boiling oil was enough to make everyone shudder. At that moment, Another voice rose. Ibrahim al-Shatibi, a Moorish physician from Granada, calmly proposed. In my land, we heal with honey and resin. Make a small incision to drain the pus. Then apply honey mixed with vinegar and myrrh. It halts corruption and allows the flesh to live again. It sounded gentler than boiling oil, and more hopeful. After heated debate, the physicians agreed to set aside their differences and attempt the Moor's remedy. Meanwhile, Beatrice sat at the princess's side, whispering Castilian fairy tales into the ears of the fevered child. At times, the little girl called for her mother, Queen Juana, still far away, or babbled about seeing a lady in white appear. The stench grew stronger, seeping into the very walls. The old soldier guarding the tower, long hardened by battlefields, murmured to his comrade, "That is the smell of death. Few soldiers ever survived it." But this was not a soldier. This was the princess of all Castile. Incense smoke curled thick in the narrow chamber of the north tower, as though dark clouds were binding everyone inside to a dreadful fate. The candle flames flickered, their light falling across the tense faces of the three physicians. Jalib, the Jewish doctor, eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. Rodriguez, the battlefield surgeon, his broad hands corded with veins. And Al-Shatibi, the Moorish healer, serene yet with eyes burning with faith in the remedies of Granada. Isabel lay between them, as fragile as a tender shoot beaten down by storm winds. The wound at her ankle was swollen, flesh blackened, seeping foul fluid that forced attendants to cover their faces with scented cloths before entering. They came and went with vinegar, boiling water, and clean linen. None a darling along, except Beatrice, the young woman whose loyalty could not be shaken. She sat close, wiping Isabel's brow, whispering old tales of Castilian knights. Sometimes her voice was drowned out by the princess's faint moans or the metallic scrape of Rodriguez sharpening his surgical knife. That night, they began to test the combined method. Jalib carefully made small incisions around the ulcer, letting the thick black pus flow out. Each foul drop was caught in a silver bowl and immediately taken away, as though keeping it too long would further pollute the chamber. Rodriguez frowned, but did not object. At least the wound was opened. Al-Shatibi stepped forward, carrying a wooden cup filled with a mixture of honey, vinegar, and powdered myrrh resin. With a wooden spoon, he spread the paste over the princess's flesh. As soon as the medicine touched her skin, the sweet scent of honey and the resin's fragrance rose, mingling with the incense, masking for a moment the stench of death. "The honey will stop death from spreading," he whispered, "and bring life back." Isabel moaned faintly, her eyelids twitching. Beatrice quickly clasped the child's hand. "It's all right, my dear. Your mother will soon be here. Be strong." Outside, in the dark corridor, rumors spread like wildfire. Servants whispered, "This is punishment for the king's trust in Jews and Moors." Others murmured, "God has withdrawn his blessing from this family." Yet smaller voices quietly prayed, "Please save the princess. She has done nothing wrong." In the city, the people already knew. Church bells tolled, procession carried relics, and thousands of candles burned all night in the square of Segovia. Old and young, craftsmen and children all watched toward the North Tower, where the life of a fragile child hung in the balance. Inside the tower, time seemed to stop, hour after hour. The physicians kept watch. Jalib took pulses, tracing faint veins under delicate skin. Rodriguez sterilized his instruments in red wine. Al-Shatibi ground more herbs, his hands steady, his voice softly reciting prayers in Arabic. By dawn, the air was so heavy that everyone felt suffocated. Then suddenly, Isabel's eyes fluttered open. Her gaze was clouded, but faintly alight. "Water," she whispered weakly. Beatrice nearly burst into tears. Lifting the princess's head and pressing cracked lips to a cup of rosewater, Isabel sipped slowly, her eyes glistening. "I dreamed of a lady in white," she murmured. "She said it is not yet time." Beatrice trembled as she squeezed the child's hand. "That is Our Lady," she said, eyes burning. "She is protecting you." The physicians exchanged glances in silence. Jalib whispered, "Her awareness is clearer. That is a good sign." Al-Shatibi unwrapped the bandage and examined it. The blackened flesh had not spread further, and along the edge appeared a faint pink line, the boundary of survival. The news quickly reached King Enrique. He rushed to the tower, though the stench forced him to cover his face with a lavender-soaked cloth. When he saw Isabel smile faintly and call "Father," his heart broke open. "There is nothing to forgive. My little girl, you need only live." But though hope had appeared, danger had not vanished. Rodriguez pointed to the dark veins, still faintly creeping up the leg. "If it continues, we must consider amputation." The words made Enrique pale. "No," he nearly roared. "No blade touches her, unless there is no other choice." The day passed with fragile hope. The people continued to pray. In the square, Jews and Moors, though discriminated against, also watched for the princess's fate, knowing that if she died, hatred might fall upon them. In the chamber, Beatrice went on telling stories. Tales of knights, humorous folk tales, anything to keep the little soul from slipping into delirium. When she told of a knight who lost a battle because he was distracted by his lover's face, Isabel's lips curved into the faintest smile, despite her exhaustion. Night fell, and the smoke thickened again. Jalib changed the bandages, noticing the discharge was less and paler. "There is progress." He nodded. Al-Shatibi added fresh honey, sensing healthy flesh separating from the dead tissue. Rodriguez, though still skeptical, had to admit, at least it is no worse. At dawn the next day, the sound of hooves thundered in the palace courtyard. Queen Juana had returned. She rushed straight to the tower, though Enrique and Beatriz tried to stop her, warning, "The smell will be unbearable. The sight will break your heart." But Juana shook her head. "She is my child. No matter her condition, I will not leave her." When she entered the chamber, Isabel was drifting in half-sleep. Yet as if sensing her mother's warmth, she opened her eyes and whispered "Mother," then smiled faintly. Juana sat down, gathering her daughter into her arms, undaunted by fear or stench. Her presence gave strength to all. The physicians explained in detail the treatment. Juana listened closely. "Resolute continue. Do not hide anything from me." Day by day, the miracle became clear. Isabel's fever dropped. Her breathing steadied. With each change of bandage, the pink outline grew more distinct, the decayed flesh sloughing away, giving space for new skin. Rodriguez carefully removed the necrosis, his hands as steady as in battle. Jalib bled her to balance the humours, while Al-Shatibi applied honey, his eyes shining with conviction. Outside, church bells rang with joy. The people of Segovia celebrated the princess's recovery. Many saw it as a sign that God still favoured the crown. Inside, Isabel was able to sit up, leaning against pillows. She curiously asked Jalib, "What is gangrene?" Jalib hesitated, then explained simply, "It is when part of the body dies, and the living part must fight not to be dragged down with it." Isabel was silent for a moment, then softly said, "Then I have won a battle." Everyone laughed in relief. A week later, Isabel was able to take a few small steps, though still bandaged. The scar would remain with her for life. But it was also a testament to miraculous strength. The king ordered a celebration. Bells rang. Trumpets blared. The whole court rejoiced. At the feast, Isabel sat beside her parents, her face still pale, but her eyes bright. She listened to knights' tales, musicians' songs, and whispered to Beatrice, "I will study medicine. One day, I will understand better what saved me." No one knew then that her words would become prophecy. The little girl who escaped death would one day become Isabel the Catholic, the queen who would change the history of Europe and the New World. The days of death's stench in the North Tower came to a close, leaving an indelible mark on the memory of the entire court. But for Isabel, that very experience lit within her young soul a resolve that life is fragile, yet strangely resilient. And sometimes, a single rose thorn is enough to open the path of destiny. The North Tower gradually grew quiet. The stench that had once terrified the palace lingered only as a ghost in memory. The velvet curtains that had sealed the windows were removed, and summer light and wind poured in, carrying the scent of fresh grass from the plains around Segovia. Yet for Isabel, the memory of those days, lost in delirium, scorched by fever, and stalked by death's breath, etched itself in her soul, like the scar on her ankle. Every limping step she took in the royal gardens reminded her life is fragile, and even the smallest mistake can exact the cost of one's existence. She remembered the accidental rose thorn, something so trivial that had brought her to the edge of hell. From then on, Isabel was no longer a carefree child. In her once innocent eyes appeared a pensive depth, a sharpness beyond the years of 8. Beatriz de Bobadilla, who had kept vigil at her bedside every hour, often recalled that after the illness, Isabel became utterly unlike the other children. While royal maidens often sought play, dance, or embroidery, Isabel was drawn to books, especially those of medicine and theology brought by the physicians. One afternoon, Beatrice entered her room to find the child carefully turning the pages of a Latin manuscript, her slender finger tracing ancient lines. "Do you understand anything in there?" Beatrice asked. Isabel looked up, her eyes alight. "Not much yet, but I want to learn, because these pages saved me." These were not idle words. Isabel began to study diligently, memorizing herbs, recalling Shatibi's explanations of honey and myrrh, or Jalib's words about the balance of humours in the body. Of course, she never intended to become a physician, but from that experience, Isabel learned a vital lesson: knowledge, whether from Jew, Moor, or Christian, has value if it saves a life. This event also changed King Enrique IV's outlook. Long criticized as weak and hesitant in politics, Enrique, upon his daughter's survival, openly defended the foreign physicians, declaring, "When a human life is at stake, medicine has no religion." The statement made many nobles frown, but it planted within Isabel a firm belief a ruler must rise above prejudice to choose what is best for the people. She remembered well that if her father had listened to fanatics demanding the expulsion of Jews and Moors from the court, she would not have lived to dream of the future. The tolerance and openness Isabel later displayed partly grew from here, though paradoxically, at the end of her life, she would be the one to sign the edicts of expulsion. But in childhood, her brush with death had planted in her mind the seed of recognition for knowledge beyond Christianity. The scar on her ankle also became a private symbol. It did not mar her beauty, but it was always a silent reminder. During ceremonies, while her long gowns concealed her legs, Isabel always felt its presence, a small rough line, but one that recalled the first time she stared into the darkness of death and returned. This forged a stronger, more decisive character. While other princesses feared the sight of blood, Isabel did not flinch at the wounded, or when hearing tales of battle. Beatrice remembered. She would often ask me, if a knight lost his arm, could he live? If he were badly wounded, could he be saved? She did not shudder, but only listened intently, as though seeking the answer. Even the physicians left lasting imprints on Isabel's life. Jalib, the cautious Jew, weighing each word, taught her the wisdom of careful speech. Rodriguez, the surgeon who had urged boiling oil, embodied the ruthless necessity of life and death decisions, something no ruler could ignore. And Al-Shatibi, the Moorish physician, with his faith in honey and myrrh, planted in her the belief that healing sometimes comes from gentleness, not only from fire and steel. 3 men, 3 different forms of knowledge, together, saved 1 child. Isabel carried that memory throughout her life, as though destiny itself had taught her early that a kingdom must draw on many strengths, many cultures, to survive. But the illness left more than a lesson in knowledge. It carved into Isabel's soul an unshakable religious faith. In her delirium, she had spoken of seeing a lady in white who said it was not yet time. For a child raised in an atmosphere of devotion, the figure could be none other than the Virgin Mary. From then on, Isabel believed she had been chosen by God, spared to fulfill a mission. Later, when facing bloody battles in the Reconquista, or when signing the decree to finance Christopher Columbus's voyage, Isabel always remembered that moment on the threshold of death in 1462. If I still live, it is because God wants me to do something great. That conviction became the strength that steadied her through political and religious storms. As time passed, Isabel regained health, rejoined festivals and feasts. Yet those who saw her remarked the princess had changed. She was no longer the carefree child, but a young maiden with a quiet gaze, listening more, speaking less. Jests and courtly songs rarely made her laugh. She turned to books, scripture, and her parents' stories of governance. Once, Isabel asked her mother, "Mother, if one day I become queen, must I also care for my people when they are sick?" As I once was, Juana was surprised, then smiled and embraced her. "Yes, my daughter. A queen does not only sit on the throne, but must also understand the suffering of her people." The event also deepened Isabel's bond with her parents. Henrique, often distant because of politics, now showed special concern. In his daughter, he saw not just a child who had escaped death, but the sole heir, the final hope of the Trastamara line. Affection mixed with anxiety made him more protective of Isabel, though later such overprotection would stir conflict at court. Juana, having once seen her daughter gaunt upon the sickbed, hardly left her side again. The queen became her anchor, teaching, comforting, always reminding Isabel that her life was a grace from God, not to be wasted. In the court, whisper spread, calling Isabel la Niña tocada por Dios, the child touched by God. The name spread beyond palace walls, into distant villages. The people believed God had spared the little girl for some great purpose, and that collective faith unwittingly cast a special halo around Isabel, setting her apart from ordinary princesses. For Isabel herself, the scar on her ankle each morning still reminded her her life was no longer hers alone. She carried a great responsibility, one she had silently accepted, even at 8 or 9 years old. Years later, when Isabel became a maiden, then Queen of Castile, those close to her recognized her iron discipline, her unshakable faith, and her unusual decisiveness. Historians often trace these traits to her lineage or the historical context, but deep down, it was the illness of 1462 in Segovia that first forged the steel of her will. When Isabel signed decrees of consequence, when she stood before her soldiers, when she refused to yield to opposition, surely her mind still echoed with childhood memories, the sealed chamber, the stench of death, Beatrice's trembling hands, and the three physicians from three cultures who together preserved her life. And so, from a single rose thorn, history was shaped. Had Isabel died at 8 years old, Spain would never have had Queen Isabel the Catholic. No historic marriage with Ferdinand. No unification of the kingdom. No Columbus crossing the Atlantic. The world itself might have been different, but Isabel lived, and she lived with the belief that her life was no accident, but a command from God. In the late nights, when all others had gone to sleep, the little Isabel would often sit by the window, her hand brushing the scar. Moonlight filtered through the curtains. The breeze whispered, and the child murmured, "I am still here, because you willed it." From that moment, the destiny of an empire quietly began. Years passed, and from the frail child on the sickbed, Isabel became a young maiden with a graceful bearing, but with eyes far sterner than her age. In those eyes lay the depth of one who had faced death and returned something no classroom could teach, no ceremony could bestow. The scar on her ankle, though usually hidden beneath long gowns, remained as a burning memory. Sometimes, walking through the gardens of Segovia, Isabel would pause, gazing at the rose bushes, wincing as if she still heard the rip of thorn through flesh. But instead of fear, Isabel saw the scar as a reminder every step along the road of power would always hide thorns. As Isabel entered maidenhood, Castilian politics grew turbulent. King Enrique IV, her father, was seen as weak by the nobility. The court fractured, lords tore at each other, and some factions even questioned Isabel's legitimacy. Whispers echoed in palace corridors. Is she truly the king's daughter in such an atmosphere of doubt? Isabel chose silence, observation, learning. Instead of struggling, she recalled the long nights of illness. Sometimes, to survive, you must lie still, conserve breath, and wait for the fever to pass. That patience became her political strength. Isabel did not hurry, but when she decided, she was firm, unyielding. As years passed, marriage became the central issue. As a royal daughter, Isabel knew she could not choose love freely like common girls. She would be a pawn in politics. But Isabel, hardened by childhood trials, refused to be wholly dictated. When advisors suggested suitors, princes of Portugal, cousins of Aragon, even dukes of France, Isabel weighed each carefully. And then she chose Ferdinand of Aragon, not only for political alliance, but because she recognized in him the same firmness, the same resolve. It was said that when Isabel first met Ferdinand, she remembered her illness. In 1462, the way Ferdinand looked straight and spoke decisively convinced her this was the man who could walk with her through trials. Just as the three physicians had once together saved her. Their wedding in 1469 at Valladolid was not as grand as many imagined. Isabel and Ferdinand married quietly, for the Castilian court was still doubtful. But to Isabel, it was the beginning of a new reign, like the second beginning of her life after surviving Segovia. Together they quickly became a rare pair of dual sovereigns ruling side by side, sharing power. Isabel often remembered the old lesson: three physicians with three different methods could save her only when they cooperated. Now she understood to rule a divided kingdom, she and Ferdinand must be two halves completing each other, not opposing. In the decade that followed, Castile and Aragon united as the foundation of a strong nation. Isabel was not a queen in name only. She directly joined councils, organized armies, reformed laws. In every decision, her decisiveness was clear once chosen. She never turned back. Historians later noted Isabel possessed a peculiar urgency, as though she always felt time short, that each decision must be made swiftly. This was understandable at 8. She had known how each hour, each minute, could decide life or death. From then on, Isabel lived and ruled with the awareness that God could call her at any moment. So every instant had to be used fully for her mission. One of Isabel's greatest trials was the conquest of Granada, the last Moorish stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula. When generals hesitated before its formidable walls, Isabel insisted on a long siege. She did not falter at the sight of disease and hunger in the camp. Officers recalled the queen walked among the soldiers, her eyes bright, like one who had once breathed death itself and no longer feared it. Indeed, Isabel had lived in a sealed chamber, breathing the stench of her own rotting flesh. Compared to that memory, the corpses at Granada only hardened her resolve. She believed that if she had survived that day, then Castile and Aragon would survive now. And that faith spread to her soldiers, keeping them steadfast until Granada surrendered in 1492. That year, Isabel made another fateful decision sponsoring Christopher Columbus's voyage. Many courtiers mocked it as madness. A dreamer from Genoa thinks he can reach India by sailing west absurd. But Isabel, with the sensitivity of one who had seen light in darkness, I felt this was a chance sent by God. When she signed the charter for Columbus, Isabel recalled that morning in Segovia, when the physician announced the gangrene had stopped spreading, that fragile moment between death and life, despair and hope she saw reflected in Columbus's eyes, and she chose to believe. The result opened the new world, reshaping human history. Yet deep within, Isabel saw it as a continuation of the miracle that had once saved her own life. However, the legacy Isabel left was not only light. Her absolute devotion, born from the memory of seeing the woman in white during her fever, made her believe that God had chosen her to purify Spain. From this belief came the Alhambra decree, expelling Jews and Moors, the very communities that had once helped save her when she was 8 years old. This was the bitter paradox of history. Perhaps Isabel believed that tolerance was only temporary, and her ultimate mission was to build a pure Christian kingdom. Or perhaps the childhood brush with death made her cling ever more tightly to faith, to the point of extremity. Whatever the reason, the illness in Segovia was the seed of both the light and the darkness in her life. It gave Isabel faith in knowledge, but also a conviction that her life was an instrument of God. At the end of her life, as Isabel lay on her sickbed in Medina del Campo, she often remembered her childhood. Records say the Queen repeatedly whispered about the tower in Segovia. In her final dream, she again saw the woman in white. Perhaps, in Isabel's mind, her entire life, from her survival, to her reign, to her unification of the kingdom and the opening of the new world, was only a continuation of that moment, the instant God allowed her to live. If you look back, everything began with a single rose thorn in a royal garden. From that seemingly trivial wound, the history of Spain and the world was altered. Isabel survived, became La Católica, the powerful queen, carrying in her heart both the light of miracle and the darkness of destiny. This story reminds us that sometimes the human history is not decided on the battlefield, but from a scar on the ankle of an 8-year-old girl. The winter of 1504 covered Medina del Campo with a thick white frost. In the cold stone palace, Queen Isabel, the Catholic, lay on her sickbed, her body frail but her eyes still bright. The long journey of a lifetime was nearing its close. Outside the window, The fires in the hearth flickered, casting red light upon the small scar at her ankle, the mark of the first battle she had fought against death. 42 years before, it is said that in her final days, Isabel often whispered about the tower in Segovia. The scene from when she was 8 returned. Vivid, as if it were yesterday, the shuttered room, the heavy incense smoke, the stench of death, Beatrice gripping her hand and telling stories, and the vision of a woman in white appearing in her delirium. To Isabel, these were not scattered memories, but the starting point of destiny. Now, as she looked back, she saw clearly from that rose thorn had come a chain of immense events. She survived to become Queen of Castile, to marry Ferdinand, to unify Aragon, to conquer Granada, to make Spain a great power. She witnessed Christopher Columbus sail west, opening the New World, laying the foundation of an empire that spanned oceans. Had Isabel died at 8, the history would surely have turned differently. Castile might have sunk into division. Spain might never have united. And perhaps the Americas would not have been drawn into Europe's orbit so soon. The survival of a child, seemingly fragile, had become a global turning point. But Isabel did not only remember glory. In her aged eyes, she also saw again the heavy decisions. The Alhambra decree of 1492 expelling hundreds of thousands of Jews from Iberia remained a stain that could not be erased. Bitterly, it was the very community that had once helped save her in illness. Dr. Jalib, the Jewish physician, had been one of the 3 who preserved the young princess's life. Yet 40 years later, she signed the decree, forcing his descendants from their homeland. Perhaps deep down, Isabel wrestled with herself. Her iron devotion, her conviction that God had chosen her for a mission, pushed her to extremity. Her survival at 8 years old, instead of making her tolerant, convinced her that any act, even cruel ones, were in God's will, so long as they served to build a Christian kingdom. That was the tragedy of destiny, light and darkness intertwined, all beginning from a small scar. In her final days, Isabel often called her daughter Juana and her grandchildren to her side. She told them of her childhood, not of thrones or treaties, but of the time she nearly died in Segovia. She emphasized, "Remember, a kingdom is saved by knowledge, loyalty, and faith. Those 3 kept me alive, and they will keep you strong." Juana listened, but her fate would take another path. After Isabel's death, Juana was confined for her madness, and it was Isabel's grandson, Charles V, who inherited her true legacy, becoming ruler of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. Yet even as D'Isondon ruled, Isabel's shadow remained. She was remembered as a queen who not only reigned, but lived with absolute conviction in a divine command. Before drawing her last breath, Isabel ordered the window of her sick room to be opened. The winter air rushed in, icy but pure. She closed her eyes gently, as though wishing one final time to breathe the free air that had once been blocked by heavy velvet curtains in the Tower of Segovia. In that moment, perhaps Isabel again saw the woman in white smiling, reaching out her hand, and she, the child once spared from death by a miracle, now stepped calmly forward, leaving behind a powerful kingdom and a newly opened world. When news of Isabel's death spread across Spain, church bells thundered. The people wept, but they also praised. To them, she was the Holy Queen, Isabel la Católica. In the villages, many whispered that it was the miracle of years past that had brought her to the throne and carried the kingdom into a golden age. But modern historians, reading back, see in the story a paradox, a rose thorn, a gangrenous wound, a child saved, changed world history. but also planted the seeds of harsh decrees, expulsions, and persecution, light and shadow, hope and sorrow, all interwoven in the name Isabel. Today, as you hear this story in the stillness of night, try closing your eyes. Picture an 8-year-old girl lying in a shuttered room, incense smoke thick, the stench of death heavy, and 3 physicians, Jewish, Moor, and Christians struggling together to reclaim her life. That image, seemingly small, was the beginning of an empire. You may feel a chill. You may feel wonder. But above all, it reminds us that human history sometimes turns on the most fragile moments: a wound, a miracle, a life or death decision. And in those moments, the fate of the world is shaped. Imagine this: after Isabel's death, in 1504, the people of Spain still spoke of her as a religious torch. Great churches and monasteries resounded with prayers for the Queen's soul. But alongside praise came whispers of doubt. The records of merchants and scholars, leaving a two-sided view of Isabel's legacy. In the eyes of many contemporaries, Isabel was a living saint. She had completed the Reconquista, the reconquest, ending 8 centuries of Moorish rule in Iberia. She had built a united Spain, a powerful kingdom reaching the seas, and above all, she had placed absolute trust in the Catholic faith, for which the Pope granted her the title La Católica. Yet for the communities who lost their homelands, who were forced to convert or expelled the Jews, the Moors, and the indigenous peoples of the New World, Isabel appeared as a shadowed figure. In the years after her death, the policies Isabel set in motion continued to expand. The Inquisition grew stronger, searching every corner, interrogating, condemning thousands, religious processions, public trials, and the flames of executions became haunting images in many cities. It is said Isabel believed absolutely in purifying the kingdom. She saw it as a sacred duty. But posterity asks, was it faith? Or was it an obsession born of childhood? A child who once saw the woman in white during fever, who believed she had been saved by God, may have carried that vision all her life. And so, every great decision from opening the way for Columbus to signing decrees of expulsion she viewed through the lens of destiny. I live because God willed it, and what I do is also His will. Isabel's legacy echoed beyond Spain's borders. In Rome, Pope Alexander VI and his successors held her as a model. The Queen of Castile was praised in ceremonies as proof of faith's power, but in other courts, she was regarded more cautiously. The French called Isabel the Iron Queen, a woman who seldom smiled, spoke sparingly, but whose every decision was unshakable. In England, the Tudor court invoked her as an example for Princess Mary. And indeed, Mary, the first daughter of Henry VIII, took the epithet the Catholic in imitation. And in Italy, where merchants had watched Spanish Jews flee into exile, Isabel was remembered not with reverence, but with another name, La Regina dell'Ombra, the Queen of Shadow. However, there is one place where Isabel lives on in memory, and that is the New World. When Columbus returned from his first voyage, bringing gold, spices, and even native inhabitants captured as slaves, Isabel looked upon them with curiosity. She is said to have ordered the release of some, believing they should be converted rather than sold. To some extent, Isabel truly believed she was bringing religious light to a distant land. But we all know that afterward, centuries of conquest and genocide turned that dream into a nightmare for millions of indigenous people. And though Isabel never witnessed it herself, her name remains tied to the beginning of that era. Back in Spain, later generations built monuments, wrote songs, and spun legends about Isabel. It is said that while she lived, she often declared, "If I die young, remember me as the child who once defeated death at Segovia." But the truth is, she lived long enough to turn that experience into a political tool, long enough to carve her name into stone, into chronicles, into the memory of humanity. To modern historians, Isabel appears as a paradox. A little girl once saved by the knowledge of Jews and Moors, who later signed the decree to expel them. A queen who once believed in the healing power of honey and myrrh, who later allowed the Inquisition to use torture and flames. A woman who once survived thanks to the loyalty and love of Beatrice, who later ruled with an iron hand, sacrificing compassion for political ends. And perhaps it is that very paradox that makes Isabel's story compelling. She was neither a perfect saint, nor a pure tyrant. She was human, a human who nearly died, who was saved, and who then lived with the conviction that each of her decisions carried meaning beyond herself. If you stand in Segovia today, looking up at the North Tower where Isabel once lay amid incense smoke and the stench of death, you will still see the narrow window. The wind rushes through its crack. Like the breath of history, the people of Segovia still tell the legend that on summer nights, if you stand at the foot of the tower, you can sometimes smell a faint trace of myrrh carried in the breeze, a remnant of the days when resins were burned to mask the odor of death around the little princess. Isabel, the small child who nearly died from a rose thorn, and later the most powerful queen of Spain, ultimately became a dual symbol, both light and shadow. She built an empire, opened the age of discovery, but also sowed seeds of division and sorrow. The story may make you reflect. Do we all carry a scar of our own? And is it that scar which shapes who we become? For Isabel, the scar on her ankle never disappeared, and it became the beginning of a path that led to the throne and to decisions that changed the world. Tonight, as you listen to this story, try placing yourself in the position of that 8-year-old girl in the North Tower. Do you hear Beatrice's whispers? Do you smell the honey and myrrh mingled with incense smoke? Do you see the dim light and the faces of physicians bent over the bed? If you imagine it clearly enough, you will understand from that moment, history was rewritten. And perhaps Isabel's story may remind you of your own scar, the trials, the times you nearly fell, but rose again, to live on and continue writing your life's tale. Voices from Segovia, the common people of Castile. During Isabel's reign, many ordinary people in Castile remembered her simply as the strongest queen we have ever seen. For them, Isabel was the one who restored order from chaos. In the markets, as merchants traded wheat and wine, they spoke of her with respect. At least now we have a queen who controls the nobles. No longer do they cut land and steal taxes as before. In the villages, the poor told stories of her visiting. Listening to grievances, Isabel truly tried to build a more disciplined administration. The people of Castile grew accustomed to seeing her as a stern mother figure, not gentle, but fair. And in their memory, her childhood illness became legend. That child nearly died. But God kept her so she could one day save the kingdom. Yet fear walked alongside admiration. Commoners trembled before the Inquisition. The processions with blazing torches leading the condemned to execution. They whispered that this darkness was also part of Isabel, like two faces of the same coin. The Jews' bitter memory. In the memory of the Jewish community, Isabel is a complex figure. For centuries before their expulsion, Jews had been physicians, shulas, merchants favored in Spanish courts, and it was they who helped save Isabel when she was 8. Abraham Jalib, the Jewish royal physician, was the first to diagnose gangrene and propose treatment. But in 1492, the same year Columbus set sail, Isabel signed the Alhambra decree forcing all Jews to convert or leave Spain. Tens of thousands of families had to sell off property, abandoning ancestral homes they had lived in for centuries. On the road, many died from hunger, thirst, and robbery. In the Jewish records of Istanbul, Salonika, and North Africa, Isabel is remembered with pain mixed with bitterness. We saved her when she was a child, and she repaid us with fire and exile. To them, she was not La Cattolica, but the queen of betrayal. Yet even within the Jewish community, there were other voices. Some who converted to remain argued that Isabel acted under the pressures of her time to preserve the unity of the kingdom. But the collective memory leaned towards sorrow, and in Jewish hymns still preserved, Isabel's name appears as a wound. The Moors, the shadow of Granada. For the Moors, Isabel was the end. Granada, the last stronghold of Islam on the Iberian Peninsula, fell to her and Ferdinand in 1492. For many Muslims, that memory was not merely the loss of a city, but the loss of an entire civilization. The Moors remembered that in the early years after surrender, Isabel had promised to respect freedom of faith. But soon after, those promises were broken. Churches rose where mosques once stood. The Quran was burned, and eventually they too were forced to convert or leave. In Moorish poetry, Isabel became the woman of fire, the one who burned Andalusia. They spoke of her with resentment, but also with a hint of awe that a woman could end 8 centuries of Islamic history on the peninsula. To them, the scar on Isabel's ankle was a strange symbol from one small wound. She had built the strength to sweep away Granada. The indigenous peoples of the Americas, light and shadow, farther away, across the ocean. Isabel's name was bound to Columbus and the Spanish fleets. In the writings of missionaries, she was remembered as the merciful queen who wished to bring the light of God to the natives. But for the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, Mexico, and Peru, that memory was drenched in blood. They saw Isabel's name carved on banners and crosses, carried alongside cavalry, muskets, disease, and slavery. Though she did not directly order massacres, her opening the way for Columbus led to millions of deaths and the collapse of the Inca, Aztec, and Taino civilizations. In surviving indigenous legends, Isabel sometimes appeared as the distant mother who sent her children to sow disaster. The image was contradictory at once, a white goddess and a phantom of misfortune. Isabel in modern historiography today, historians argue fiercely over Isabel. Some praise her as one of the greatest leaders of medieval Europe, a woman who transcended gender limits, wielded power equal to men, and transformed Spain into a superpower. Others see her as the author of 2 tragedies, the catastrophe of the Inquisition and the genocide of the Americas. They call her the mother of colonial empire and hold her responsible for centuries of suffering. But what no one denies is that Isabel was a decisive figure. And if one traces it back, everything began with a small wound, a rose thorn piercing an ankle in Segovia. It was that which convinced Isabel her life belonged to God, and that every decision she made was a divine command. The memory that remains in Segovia today, visitors to the Alcázar of Segovia can still climb the North Tower. Guides whisper the story of the princess who nearly died, of the shuttered room, the incense and honey mingling with the stench of death. Some say that on moonlit nights, they smell resin in the corridor, a lingering echo of the treatments in 1462, and in the square of Segovia, the statue of Isabel stands tall, holding orb and cross. Children run around it. The elderly rest in its shade. But few notice the Latin words carved at its base, ex spinis rosa, from thorns. A rose blooms. That is Isabel's story. From a rose thorn came a queen, and with her, an empire. When people think of Isabel la Cattolica, Two images usually come to mind: the Queen standing tall, cross in hand, on the day Granada fell, and the woman nodding her assent for Columbus to set sail, opening the age of exploration. But if you look deeper, you will see Isabel's legacy did not end with those two moments of glory. It spread like ripples across water, reaching centuries ahead, touching lands and peoples Isabel herself could never have imagined. In Spanish culture, Isabel became a double-edged symbol. In grand cathedrals like Toledo or Seville, statues were raised to her, calling her the mother of the nation. Children in textbooks were once taught that Isabel was the model of faith and steadfastness. But at the same time, folk stories endured tales of Jewish exiles remembering her as the one who drove us from our homes, or Moorish descendants sighing that she was the woman of fire. One legend tells that whenever the wind sweeps through the rose gardens of Segovia, people hear the faint sound of a child's ragged breath. It is the breath of 8-year-old Isabel on that sweltering night, in the shuttered room, thick with incense smoke. That story, though only legend, is still told by mothers to their daughters. As a reminder, a woman can walk through death to become a living symbol. After Isabel's death, Europe entered the turbulent 16th century. Her descendants, especially Charles V and Philip II, turned Spain into the most powerful empire of its time. Stretching from the Iberian Peninsula to the Americas and the Philippines. But the rigidity and absolute religious faith Isabel left behind became a double-edged sword. Charles V continued the policy of defending Catholicism, leading to religious wars with the Protestant princes of Germany. Philip II carried this legacy to extremity, dragging Spain into exhausting wars, from Flanders to the Spanish Armada's clash with England in 1588. These decisions all stemmed from Isabel's transmitted belief that the kingdom was blessed by God, and every act in defense of the faith was justified. Yet across the ocean, Isabel's legacy took another form. When Columbus set foot on the island of Guanahani, he declared the land belonged to Isabel and Ferdinand, monarchs of Spain. From that moment, Isabel's name was bound to the entire history of the conquest of the Americas. Imagine a small Taino village in the Caribbean. They saw flags bearing the cross, heard the name Isabel shouted in Spanish prayers. For them, Isabel was a foreign name, yet one that determined their fate from freedom to slavery, from peaceful villages to battlefields. To this day, many cities, streets, and even islands in Latin America still bear the name Isabel. Her name became part of geography itself, a reminder that she remains present in every corner of the New World. In Europe, artists and writers centuries later did not ignore Isabel either. In Baroque painting, she appeared as a saintly figure, eyes turned to heaven, hand resting on the Bible. But in modern literature, novelists portrayed her as a tragic character, a woman haunted by childhood illness, convinced she was saved by God, and spending her life acting as an instrument of faith, sometimes at the cost of humanity. A 19th century play even depicted Isabel, old and weary, sitting alone at night, gazing at the scar on her ankle and whispering, "Because of this wound, I made the whole world another wound." But to be fair, Isabel also opened doors for new knowledge. She allowed converted Jewish scholars to remain at court, contributing to translations of Greek, Arabic, medical, and philosophical texts into Latin. Many universities were sponsored, and Castilian education flourished under her reign. From this perspective, Isabel was not only the Queen of Fire and Cross, but also one who laid the foundations for Spain to become a center of learning. Though later the Inquisition stifled intellectual growth, the seeds Isabel planted still sprouted. The modern world views Isabel through polarized lenses. In 1974, the Catholic Church opened her canonization process. Many Spanish Catholics saw her as a model of virtue and sacrifice, but this movement immediately met opposition from Jewish communities and international scholars who argued that one cannot sanctify someone who had signed the expulsion of the Jews and inaugurated the Inquisition. The debate continues to this day. Some wish to remember Isabel as the mother of modern Spain. Others insist on remembering her as the origin of colonial tragedy. But whichever side you take, one cannot deny Isabel's life was bound to paradox. A child saved by Jews and Moors, who later expelled them. A princess cured by honey and myrrh, who later empowered a court that used fire and shackles. A little girl soothed by fairy tales in fever, who later turned that faith into policy for an entire kingdom. If you sit and listen to this story in the quiet of night, you may feel Isabel still lingers gentle as Beatrice's whispers in the sealed room, harsh as the church bells tolling when Granada fell. Today, in Segovia, the North Tower still stands. Visitors pass by, a few knowing that once the room was filled with incense smoke, where an 8-year-old lay close to death. But if you stay until evening, when the wind slips through the narrow window, you may hear a faint whisper, "Not yet." And indeed, not yet was the message running through Isabel's life. At 8, not yet time to die. At 14, not yet time to surrender the throne. At 30, not yet time to stop at Castile but to push on to Granada. In 1492, not yet time to close the world, but to open it with fleets sailing across the Atlantic. Until finally, when closing her eyes at Medina del Campo, Isabel sighed, "Now it is time." If there is one thing we can draw from this story, it is this: history is not written only by battles and thrones, but sometimes by a small scar. A rose thorn in a palace garden led to the life of one of the most powerful and controversial figures in Europe. And perhaps that is why Isabel's story always leaves the listener unsettled. It is both a lullaby and a warning. Be careful with the scars in your life, for they may shape not only your fate, but also the fate of the world. If Isabel la Católica was the blazing flame of the 15th century, then in other corners of Europe, female lights were also beginning to burn. The interesting thing is that when you place them side by side, Isabel of Castile, Elizabeth of England, and Catherine de' Medici of France, you see three very different portraits, all women wielding power in a man's world, but leaving their marks in very different ways. Elizabeth I of England, daughter of Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII, rose to the throne after the bloody storms of the Tudor family. Unlike Isabel, Elizabeth grew up in an atmosphere of suspicion, not battling a near-fatal illness, but accusations and the shadow of execution hovering constantly. If Isabel believed God chose her through a childhood miracle, Elizabeth learned that to survive, one must stay silent, observe, and when the moment came, strike with sharp political blows. Isabel believed in not yet. Elizabeth believed in no one but me. Isabel leaned on religion to legitimize her power. Elizabeth on the image of the Virgin Queen. Seeing herself as wife to all of England, one drew strength from faith. The other turned solitude into a political weapon. Both unified their nations. Isabel joined Castile and Aragon. Elizabeth held England together amid storms of Protestant-Catholic division. But their paths differed. Isabel chose purification, removing those who were different. Elizabeth chose compromise, allowing balance for stability. When comparing, you see, one bore the scar on her ankle, a reminder that life came only from absolute faith. The other bore scars of the soul, witnessing her mother's beheading, learning to hide emotions to survive. And Catherine de' Medici, Italian-born Queen of France, was a different story still. Catherine had no miracle to save her in youth, but another obsession, the loneliness of a foreign bride, scorned by the French court, When her husband died young, she became regent, ruling a France in turmoil. If Isabel ruled by faith, Catherine ruled by intrigue, mastering control of court and household. Isabel left behind the image of a holy queen. Catherine left behind the reputation of the poison queen. Though much of it may have been slander, both were severe, but their roots differed. Isabel believed she was chosen by God, acting in his name. Catherine believed no one would protect her but herself, acting in the name of survival. Comparing the three, Isabel stands apart. Elizabeth was a master of patience and diplomacy. Catherine, a master of intrigue. And Isabel, a master of faith and will. For Isabel, every decision, marriage to Ferdinand, the war for Granada, or sponsoring Columbus, was placed within the frame of divine command. That was both her strength and her tragedy. Strength, because it made her steadfast, unshaken by storms. Tragedy, because it led to decisions later seen as cruel, expelling Jews and Moors. Opening the tragedies of the New World, Elizabeth, facing the Spanish Armada, declared, "I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." Catherine, facing the blood of the Saint Bartholomew's Day massacre, chose silence to keep her throne. Isabel, facing life and death, said, "Not yet." Just 3 words, but enough to shape her life and an empire. Posterity often places Isabel and Elizabeth side by side, calling them the two queens who built modern Europe. Elizabeth paved the way for England's rise, Isabel for Spain's empire. But while Elizabeth rose through flexibility and pragmatism, Isabel rose through unwavering faith. This made their legacies different as well. The British Empire left marks in trade, language, law. The Spanish Empire left marks in religion, Catholic culture, and the painful memories of the Americas. Catherine de' Medici was less praised. But when placed beside them, the picture is complete. 3 paths women could take to survive and rule in a man's world: faith, independence, and intrigue. The modern world often celebrates Elizabeth I as an enlightened queen, Catherine de' Medici as a symbol of manipulation, and Isabel la Cattolica remains disputed. Yet it is that very dispute that makes her fascinating, both saint and shadow, both mother of a nation and harbinger of global tragedy. If you think of Isabel in the still night, perhaps you will not see her alone. Her figure stands alongside Elizabeth and Catherine, 3 women, 3 paths, 3 uses of power, 1 tied to the cross, 1 to the virgin crown, and 1 to the fabled vial of poison. All 3 proved one truth. European history was not only made by kings in iron helmets on battlefields, but also by women who bent destiny to their own ways. If you close your eyes, imagine them meeting in some imagined chamber, Isabel sitting upright, hand on the Bible, Elizabeth in her golden gown, eyes sharp behind a proud smile, Catherine turning a ring, lips curved in a half-light, half-dark smile. 3 women, 3 paths, but one common thread they understood. Power was not only crowns on heads, but scars. Scars on skin, scars in hearts, scars in memory, and those scars made them legends. And so, from a small rose thorn in the Garden of Segovia, history opened the path of one of Europe's most powerful and controversial queens. Isabel la Cattolica, the princess who nearly died in the suffocating North Tower, survived, grew, and turned a kingdom into a world-spanning empire. But as you have seen, light and shadow always walked together. She was both mother of a united Spain, and the signer of decrees expelling those who once saved her life. She was both the one who gave men the chance to cross the Atlantic, and the one who unwittingly opened pages of blood-soaked history for the Americas. Perhaps it is this paradox that makes Isabel's story captivating. She was not a perfect saint, nor un pur démon. She was human, with a small scar on her ankle. But from that scar, the world was changed. Tonight, as you close your eyes, remember that we all carry our own scar. Sometimes it is a painful memory, a turning point, a moment we thought we would fall. But perhaps it is that very scar that shapes us into who we must become, as it did Isabel. So let this story drift away like incense smoke in the old tower. Let it lull you into sleep, with a small faith that no matter how vast the world, every great journey can begin from the most fragile moment. May you have a deep, peaceful sleep, until we meet again in the next story, beneath the quiet night sky. Sleep well.